The main function of the whole urinary system is to get rid of metabolic waste products and to reabsorb water and other useful nutrients. But the potentially harmful substances to the body, like carbon dioxide, nitrogenous waste like urea, bile salts, and pigments, need to be eliminated through the kidneys after they are no further use, so they don't accumulate and become harmful, such as when a blocked cat comes in and they have a potentially fatal amount of potassium that has been allowed to accumulate that can cause fatal arrhythmias to the heart. And they often have increased BUN or urea counts as well as creatinine from the blockage, not allowing these products to be eliminated. So the parts of the urinary system consist of two kidneys, the right and the left. The left kidney is the more caudal kidney in the abdomen, and you can remember this by remembering the left kidney is left behind. Then there are two ureters that extend from the kidneys into the bladder obviously, and then one urethra. The kidney functions are to produce urine to facilitate the elimination of metabolic waste materials, the maintenance of homeostasis through blood filtration, reabsorption, secretion, and fluid balance regulation through the antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone, acid-base regulation, and the production of hormones, which most importantly includes erythropoietin, which you may remember is the hormone responsible for stimulating the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. It's in the name erythropoietin, so erythro or eryth means red blood cells. Erythrocytes are red blood cells, and most hormones end in IN. So erythropoietin is the red blood cell hormone, and if a cat has chronic kidney disease, they often are anemic because they have a lack of this hormone telling the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. And lastly, blood pressure regulation. So some gross anatomy of the kidneys. The kidney is covered in a connective fibrous outer capsule. There is the renal hilus, which is the indented area on the medial side of the kidney where the ureters, nerve, blood, and lymph vessels all enter and leave the kidney. And then there's the renal pelvis, which is the funnel-shaped area inside the hilus where everything drains into and collects the urine for it to be sent out through the ureter. More gross anatomy of the kidneys. So the outer layer of the kidney is called the renal cortex, and the more inner layer is the renal medulla. The calyx or calyces in plural are on the inside, and this is what the cup-like extensions of the renal pelvis drain into. So basically is where the urine is directed into the renal pelvis by these calyces. And the next slide, they'll get into more of how there's different shapes and sizes and morphology related to kidney shape. Here is some more gross anatomy of kidneys. So the top one is a pig and cattle kidney. Both of them are multi-pyramidal or multilobular. On the bottom is a cat or dog kidney, and they are unipyramidal or unilobular, meaning they are bean shaped. They don't have the lobular appearance as the ones above do. So those are the big differences in those species shaping of kidneys. So the microscopic anatomy of the kidney, the most basic functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. It is the smallest part of the kidney that carries out all the basic functions. There are lots of different variations in the number of nephrons per kidney in different animals. So, for example, in a medium-sized cat, there will be about 200,000 nephrons per kidney. A medium-sized dog will have about 700,000 nephrons per kidney. Next is the renal corpuscle. So that is located in the cortex of the kidney, and it is made up of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus is a tuft of glomerular capillaries, and the Bowman's capsule is a double-walled capsule that surrounds the glomerulus. The inner layer of the Bowman's capsule is the visceral layer, and it is adhered closely to the surfaces of the glomerular capillaries, and the outside layer is the parietal layer. Just like every other organ, there is the visceral layer on the inside and the parietal layer on the outside. The visceral layer has podocytes, so podo means foot, so foot cells. They have foot-like extensions that cover the glomerular capillaries, and the podocytes that are covering the capillaries have spaces in between them that create a permeable layer through which filter substances or dissolved substances can pass through. So the filtration of blood occurs in the renal corpuscle by high blood pressure that forces the blood through the glomerular capillaries and forces some plasma into the capsular space. The fenestrations in the capillaries of the endothelium allow this, and the glomerular filtrate is then formed. The glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, depends on the rate of blood flow through the kidneys, but it is expressed in milliliters per minute. So a 25-pound dog, for example, will have approximately 180 mils of plasma flow through the kidneys every minute. As the blood passes through the kidneys, about 45 mils of glomerular filtrate is formed every minute. So, in other words, about 25% of the plasma is removed from circulation each minute. Over a 24-hour period, that amount equals about 64 liters of glomerular filtrate being formed, which is more than 16 gallons. So that is an important function of the GFR. Another kind of important, I guess, tidbit to take away, the high pressure that is forced through there is also why cats that have hyperthyroidism often don't have kidney disease that shows on blood work, because their cardiac output from their heart rate being so high forces blood through the Bowman's capsule and makes that high blood pressure system work better. And this makes it look like the kidneys are functioning properly because of that heart rate and cardiac output. But when the heart rate is fixed by by methimazole or hyperthyroid medication, and the heart rate is controlled, then often this high blood pressure system isn't functioning as well, and kidney disease can be uncovered at that point. So hyperthyroidism masks kidney disease kind of through this system, with the output of blood from the heart and the pressurized system forcing that filtrate through, or forming that filtrate, and making it look like their kidneys are performing properly when they actually are not. For reabsorption, there are useful substances that leave the tubules of the nephron and enter the bloodstream through the peritubular capillaries. These are sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, glucose, amino acids, chloride, bicarbonate, and water. So sodium is actively transported out of the cell into the interstitial fluid where it moves into peritubular capillaries, and some of the other ones are passively transported, but there's something called sodium co-transport where no extra energy is expended for things like glucose and amino acids because they hitch a ride with the sodium and on the same protein. And once the sodium is in the epithelial cell, it gets actively pumped out of the cell into the interstitial fluid. The glucose and amino acids passively diffuse out of the tubular epithelial cell into interstitial fluid and then into the peritubular capillaries. So basically, a lot of the ions, water, etc., are passively transported, either by passive transport or by osmosis for the water. So as you'll remember, osmosis is the passive transport of water through a membrane from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So it's trying to maintain that homeostatic or homeostasis in the body. So I think the important thing to probably remember here is that sodium is actively transported, but then some of the other ones can hitch a ride with the sodium at the same time. So the reabsorption of potassium and calcium are reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, the ascending loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. Calcium moves under the influence of vitamin D, the parathyroid hormone, and calcitonin. Magnesium is reabsorbed from the proximal convoluted tubule, the ascending loop of Henle, and the collecting duct. And it also is increased in reabsorption by the parathyroid hormone. So kind of interesting enough that the parathyroid hormone does have some function from the kidney, but it does make sense because the parathyroid hormone does have that negative feedback loop, and it needs to tell the body to reabsorb calcium when needed if there is some missing calcium. You also might remember that back in the bones part of last semester that if there isn't enough calcium in the blood, then the parathyroid hormone will tell the bones to let go of calcium so that they're able to direct that into the blood system. So secretion is the last stop basically for any waste products that weren't already eliminated or removed from the filtrate. So if there are waste products left, then they can be eliminated by the secretion that is occurring in the distal convoluted tubular. So the main substances that are removed are hydrogen, potassium, and ammonia. They can also eliminate antibiotics such as penicillin and sulfonamides, which is useful in urinary tract infections because the longer that antibiotic is allowed to work in the urine or stay in the urine, the more effective it's going to be at killing bacteria. So it's actually advantageous that it takes almost the last step for this to be removed. So it's spending as much time as possible in that urine killing that bacteria before it's finally secreted out through the peritubular capillaries in the distal convoluted tubule. Urine volume regulation is determined by the amount of water contained in the tubular filtrate when it reaches the renal pelvis. So two hormones are responsible for controlling how much water is either reabsorbed or retained or let go. So the antidiuretic hormone, so antidiuretic, diuretic means to lose water. So antidiuretic is to conserve or to retain water. So that is an important hormone because if we didn't have that, then we would just lose a whole bunch of water through our urine when the body would need it, which results in dehydration. So the antidiuretic hormone, if absent, would result in polyuria or increased urine production from the loss of water into the urine. The aldosterone increases the reabsorption of sodium into the bloodstream in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So through the osmotic imbalance, um, we know that sodium will take water with it. So if there is a reabsorption of sodium into the bloodstream, then water will follow that sodium and will be held on to by the body. The regulation of blood pressure is also maintained by the kidneys in part. Like the last slide, I put that little tip on the bottom about wherever sodium goes, water usually follows. So in this case, sodium also is increasing amounts of water that is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So if there's more water in the bloodstream, then that increases the blood volume. When the blood volume increases, so does the blood pressure. So this is one way that the blood pressure is regulated is through water by increased amounts of sodium being reabsorbed. You can maybe be also helped by remembering that that's why people that have high blood pressure are on salt-restricted diets. So if they were eating too much salt, then they are going to have even more blood volume, which is going to increase their blood pressure even more. So low sodium diets are so that this whole water retention system isn't excessive or is even lowered so that the blood volume and the blood pressure is decreased. The other part of this is the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. So it's a complicated system, but it basically responds to bring the blood pressure to normal when it's falling below normal. Um, so basically, it's done by the sodium potassium system and the sodium that was just described. There's also the response to release renin, which is the enzyme that facilitates the splitting of angiotensin 1 from angiotensin. So this is what ACE inhibitors do. They're an angiotensin converting enzyme. So it is something that is basically splitting this molecule and it's increasing the blood pressure this way by also stimulating the release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands, which does the whole sodium water reabsorption that was just described. Now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the bladder and ureters and urethra. So the ureters are the two tubes that extend from the kidneys and connect to the bladder. They connect in the trigone area, which is somewhat of a triangular part of the bladder that is where the bladder and the neck of the urethra basically open up. So in the trigone is where the ureteral openings come into the bladder, so that's where they drain into. And it's also where the urethra is formed leaving the bladder. The ureters, like we said before, they leave the kidney at the hilus. That's where everything enters and exits the kidneys. There are three layers: the outer fibrous layer, the middle muscular layer, which is composed of smooth muscle, and this is what propels urine by peristalsis. As an important note, this is also how, if you have cats that have um, feline lower urinary tract disease or they are blocked, then this is what prazosin does. It works on that smooth muscle and helps relax it because it can also cause spasming, and that doesn't help when they're trying to urinate and they already have inflammation. So prazosin works on this particular smooth muscle that is inside the ureters and the urethra. So then there's an inner epithelial layer, just like everything else. that allows the ureters to stretch when urine is passing through. The anatomy of the bladder is pretty self-explanatory. There are transitional epithelial cells that stretches the bladder as it fills with urine. These transitional cells are something that you'll see in urine when you're looking at it under the microscope. There are also the transitional cells that can become cancerous and can form into transitional cell carcinoma. The detrusor muscle is the muscle that contracts to expel urine. And again, as another kind of side note, if anyone is familiar with botanical, this is the drug that works on the detrusor muscle to help the muscular contractions to expel urine. In neurology, we have used it quite often when we have patients that they have a traumatic disc injury or spinal cord injury, and we're not really sure if they can have that muscle contraction. So sometimes we'll use botanical to help with that muscle contraction if it's there. And then there's circular sphincter muscles that are around the neck of the bladder that provide voluntary control. So this is when you're holding your bladder, you're voluntarily controlling these sphincter muscles to hold the urine. So just some more terminology, basically. Urination is also called micturition or uresis, and it is the expulsion of urine from the urinary bladder into the urethra for elimination from the body. Very obviously, urine has to accumulate, muscle contraction has to happen, and sphincter control must happen. So for the urethra, the biggest difference between male and female is that females have a shorter, straighter urethra, and males have a longer, curved one that curves along their pelvic inlet. This is the reason that male cats can block way easier than female cats, although I've seen probably about 4 or 5 female cats in the last 12 years of ER medicine that have been blocked. But many, many, many male cats. We usually have at least 2 a week, if not more, in hospital. So they are more prone to this because their urethras are longer and skinnier, so that allows for the mucus and crystal plugs to form and stay there easier than female cats. So longer and curved for males and shorter for females, which we think would make placing a female catheter easier in a dog, but it isn't. It's way more difficult, but that's the biggest difference and one that needs to be remembered for why cats block, male cats block.